In 1963, Bumpy Johnson's 300-pound son-in-law grabbed his throat with both hands, biggest mistake of his life. No gun, no knife, no blood, just Bumpy straightening his tie, walking out clean, while that 300-pound man sat staring at two hands that would never close again. What kind of man walks in unarmed and permanently breaks something on the way out? Harlem smelled like burnt tobacco, cold rain, and old blood that the sidewalk never fully absorbed. Ellsworth Johnson stood at his third-floor window and looked down at 116th Street the way a surgeon looks at a body before cutting calm. Precise, already knowing exactly where the damage was hiding. Every corner belonged to him, not on paper, not with a title, in the way that actually mattered, the way men stepped aside when his car rolled through, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence when his name came up, the way even the police precinct 2 blocks north kept their eyes pointed somewhere else. His phone rang. He let it ring twice. "Daddy?" Elise's voice came through, thin and careful, the voice of a woman who had spent years measuring every word before releasing it into the air. "It's just dinner. One night. Can you please just be my father tonight? Not Bumpy. Just Ellsworth. Just come eat and come home." He stood there listening to the way she breathed between sentences, short, controlled. The breathing of someone who had learned that taking up too much air in a room could be dangerous. "I'll be there at 7, he said, and hung up. The problem with leaving Harlem even for one night was that Harlem was a living thing with a pulse and a memory. The moment a king went quiet, the city felt it like a drop in temperature. Mouths that had been shut for months started opening. Men who smiled at you on Monday started having private conversations by Wednesday. Bumpy had watched it happen to other men. He had survived it happening to him twice in 1954, once in 1959, and once in a bathroom at a club on Lenox Avenue that nobody talked about anymore because the two men involved were no longer alive to talk. He was not leaving his kingdom unguarded. Illinois pulled the car around at 6'15" and 6'2", broad through the shoulders, carrying a Connecticut driver's license and a transportation contractor registration that were both completely legal and completely real. 4 other men were already in position before Bumpy reached the sidewalk. 2 at the neighborhood boundary, 1 outside the building, 1 circling the block in a gray sedan, no weapons showing. No reason for any badge to slow down and ask questions. Clean, invisible. The kind of protection that looks like nothing until it becomes everything. Bumpy came downstairs in a charcoal suit, white shirt, dark tie, no rings, no watch worth mentioning. He looked like a man who filed other people's taxes and went home to a quiet apartment and a glass of warm milk. That was the entire point. The most dangerous thing Bumpy Johnson ever learned was how to look like the least dangerous man in any room. Illinois said nothing as they pulled north out of the city. He never talked in the car. That silence was worth more than any weapon. It meant Illinois understood that information and noise were opposites, and that in this business, noise got men buried. Bumpy watched Harlem disappear in the rear window, the buildings shrinking, the streets widening, the air getting cleaner and colder and somehow more dishonest the further north they drove. Somewhere past the state line, the trees closed in on both sides of the highway, and everything went dark and manicured and expensive. He thought about what Elise had said. Don't be Bumpy tonight. The thing she never understood, the thing no one who loved him ever fully understood, was that Ellsworth and Bumpy were not two different men. There was no costume. There was no version of him that didn't automatically count the exits in a room, didn't clock the weight distribution of the man standing closest to him, didn't feel the temperature of a situation change 3 seconds before anyone else in the room noticed anything was wrong. Some men are shaped by violence. Bumpy Johnson had been sharpened by it the way a blade is sharpened, losing everything soft until only the edge remains. He looked out at the black Connecticut trees and felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. Not fear. Bumpy Johnson had not felt fear since 1946. This was something quieter and more precise than fear. This was recognition, the feeling of a man who has walked into enough wrong rooms to know before the door even opens that something on the other side is already broken. Tonight had the smell of a room where someone was about to make the last mistake of their life. He just didn't know yet whose mistake it was going to be. In every city in America, there are men the police watch and men the police fear. Bumpy Johnson was the second kind, and tonight, he was driving straight toward a man who didn't know the difference. The house was obscene. Not beautiful obscene. The kind of house that doesn't say I worked hard but screams I need you to know I won. Stone driveway wide enough for a funeral procession. Lawn cut so perfectly it looked like green carpet stapled to the earth. 2 stone lions flanking the front steps, mouths open, frozen mid-roar. Claws extended, decorative, useless, and somehow exactly right for the man who lived inside. Illinois stopped the car at the edge of the property. Bumpy sat still for exactly 4 seconds and read the house the way he used to read a street corner lights on upstairs. Lights blazing in the living room. Kitchen lit up bright. Marcus Sterling wanted to be seen from the driveway. He was already performing before his audience even got out of the car. The front door swung open before Bumpy reached the steps. Marcus Sterling filled the doorframe the way a wall fills a room. 300 pounds of tailored suit, gold cufflinks, and a grin so wide it showed the back teeth. He extended his hand and grabbed Bumpy's with the grip of a man who had read in a business book that a crushing handshake communicates power. The kind of grip designed to make the other man wince and establish hierarchy before a single word gets spoken. Bumpy did not wince. He shook Marcus's hand and looked at him with flat, still, completely empty eyes, the eyes of a man who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "Mr. Johnson." Marcus grinned and clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to move a smaller man sideways. "The famous tax man. Elise talks about you all the time, all the time. Come in, she's been cooking since noon. Nervous as a cat. Honestly. Wanted everything perfect for the great Ellsworth Johnson." Bumpy stepped inside. The house smelled like candle wax, expensive cologne. And underneath, both something medicinal. Something used to cover other smells. Something that made the hairs on Bumpy's arms stand up without making a single visible change to his face. Elise came out of the kitchen wiping her hands. She was wearing a long-sleeved dress in the middle of July. The sleeves came all the way down to her wrists. Bumpy looked at the sleeves for exactly 1 second and then looked at her face and smiled like a father who had not just noticed anything at all. She hugged him and he felt how much weight she had lost. Not diet weight. Not intentional weight, but the weight a body drops when it has been existing in a constant state of low-grade terror for so long that eating becomes something you forget to do. She smelled like perfume, stacked 3 layers deep. The way women perfume themselves when they are trying to bury something underneath the flowers. "You look tired, baby," he said quietly, just for her ears. "I'm fine, Daddy," she said immediately. The words came before he even finished his sentence, automatic, rehearsed, the answer of a woman who has been asked, "Are you okay?" so many times that she stopped actually processing the question and started just producing the correct sound. Bumpy let go of her and stepped back and said nothing. In Harlem, that answer would have ended a man's evening. In Connecticut, it started dinner. The silverware hit the china like a clock that was counting down to something nobody at the table was willing to say out loud. Marcus had opened the Pappy Van Winkle 23-year bourbon, the kind of bottle that costs more than a month's rent in most of Harlem. The kind men display not because they enjoy the taste, but because they need you to understand what category of person you are sitting across from. He poured for himself. He poured for Bumpy. He did not pour for Elise. She reached for the water glass instead, and Marcus's eyes followed her hand for exactly half a second, the look of a man checking that his property was behaving correctly. Bumpy watched that look the way a hawk watches a field. Marcus talked. He talked about real estate deals in Hartford and New Haven. He talked about politicians he had dinner with, contracts he had won, men he had outmaneuvered. He talked about the world in terms of lions and sheep, who was dominant, who was weak, who deserved exactly what they got because they lacked the intelligence or the spine to take what was theirs. His voice filled the dining room the way smoke fills a closed space, thick, spreading, leaving no room for anything else to breathe. You know what separates the lions from the sheep, Mr. Johnson. Marcus leaned forward and pointed his fork across the table. Decision, the ability to decide, and then act, and never apologize for either one. Most men hesitate. That hesitation is the thing that kills them. Is that right? Bumpy said. Not a question. He was not listening to the words. He was cataloging data. The way Marcus's hand shook slightly on his fourth pour. Not nerves. Alcohol already metabolizing through a system that processed it regularly and heavily. The way Elise cut her food into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of it. Her eyes tracking her husband's glass like a woman who had learned that the level of bourbon in that glass was the most important information in the room. The way she had started 2 sentences at dinner and stopped both of them before they were finished. Her eyes flicking sideways to Marcus first, reading whether it was safe to continue. Bumpy set down his fork, picked up his napkin, folded it once, set it beside his plate. Then Marcus stood up and said the words, "Let me show you my office. Man talk." He winked at Elise, not a wink of warmth. A wink of dismissal. The kind that says you are not included in what happens next, and led Bumpy down the hallway. The office smelled like cigars, leather, and the specific airless quality of a room where a man has spent years talking to himself and calling it thinking. An elk head mounted above the desk, glassy-eyed and dead and permanent. Magazine covers in frames. Photographs with politicians, their arms around Marcus's shoulders, their smiles as real as the stone lions on the front steps. Marcus sat on the edge of his desk, and his face changed. The performance dropped away like a coat falling off a hook. Sudden, clean, revealing something underneath that was harder and colder and far more honest than anything he had shown at the dinner table. "I'm going to be direct with you," Marcus said. "Elise worries about your reputation, about what it means for my business if the wrong people connect her to your history in Harlem. I've protected her from that. I've kept her name clean for 4 years. He took a slow, deliberate sip of bourbon and looked at Bumpy the way a man looks at a debt he is confident he can collect. "I think you owe me some gratitude for that." The room went completely silent. Bumpy looked at Marcus Sterling, all 300 pounds of constructed confidence, all that borrowed power, all that performance, and said absolutely nothing. He just looked at him. Steady, still, the way a lake looks still right before the bottom drops out from underneath you. Marcus's smile held for 4 seconds, then 5. Then it began to develop a tremor at the corners. Small, almost invisible, the tremor of a man who has just realized, too late, that he has said something to someone who does not react the way normal people react, and that the silence he is sitting inside is not the silence of a man who is offended. It is the silence of a man who has already decided. Some lessons in this world are written in contracts, some are written in newspaper headlines, and some, the ones that stick, are written directly into the body, in a language that requires no translation. The office door was solid oak, 2 inches thick, built by a man who needed the rest of his house to pretend it could not hear what happened inside. Bumpy stood in the hallway with his right hand pressed flat against the wood and listened the way a doctor presses a stethoscope against a chest, not waiting for something to begin, but reading what had already been running for a long time and had simply been hidden behind the right kind of door. Marcus's voice came first. Low, patient. The voice of a man explaining something to someone he had long since stopped considering an equal. Then Elise's voice, thin, careful. Each word weighed before it left her mouth, the way a person tests ice before stepping onto it, because she already knew from experience exactly how much weight this particular surface could hold before it gave way. Then Marcus's voice dropped another full register, denser, the specific compression of air that happens in a room right before something breaks. Not louder. Never louder. Because loud was for amateurs, and Marcus Sterling had long since moved past the amateur stage of this particular education. A glass hit the floor and exploded. Then a chair scraped hard across hardwood like something being shoved out of the way. Then the slap, flat, efficient. The sound of an open hand that knew the precise location of its target because it had visited that location before. In this room. Against this woman. Enough times that it required no force to be effective. Just placement, just the reminder that the system was still operational and the rules had not changed. Bumpy's hand pressed harder into the door. What came after the slap was the thing that opened something out and permanent inside Bumpy Johnson's chest, not crying, not protest, not the involuntary raw sound a human body produces when something violent and unexpected is done to it. Nothing. Instant, complete, practice nothing. The silence of a woman who had been hit enough times in this room to understand at the cellular level that the safest response her body could produce was to vanish, to pull every sound, every reaction, every evidence of interior life back inside herself and seal it there until the air pressure in the room changed back to something survivable. His daughter had learned to disappear inside her own body. Inside her own home. She had practiced it until it was faster than thought. Bumpy stood in that hallway and felt something move through him that was not grief and was not rage and was not the hot, blind animal thing that less disciplined men would have acted on immediately. It was colder than all of those things. It was the feeling of a verdict being reached in a room with no jury. No appeal. And no timeline except the one that produced the cleanest result. He pushed off the wall, walked back down the hallway past the imported rugs and the oil painting and the crystal side table and every expensive object this man had assembled to prove to visitors that he had won at life. Sat back down at the dining room table, folded his hands in front of him on the white tablecloth, and waited with the absolute stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is simply allowing events to reach their natural conclusion on their own schedule. A king does not move in anger. This was not philosophy. This was not restraint performed for an audience. This was the single most operationally lethal principle Bumpy Johnson had applied across 40 years of surviving in a world that had tried to remove him from it repeatedly and failed every time. Anger makes a man fast and careless. Careless men leave evidence. Evidence was the only shield that could protect Marcus Sterling from what was already in motion. And Bumpy had no intention of handing him that shield. Marcus came back through the hallway 2 minutes later, smoothing his jacket with one hand and running the other through his hair. His face reconstructed into the easy, confident expression of a man who considers the interruption handled and the evening ready to resume. Behind him, Elise walked out with her eyes aimed at the floor, her left hand touching her cheekbone, once a gesture so brief and so automatic she was almost certainly unaware she had made it before dropping back to her side. Marcus sat down heavily, refilled his bourbon glass to the top, and leaned back in his chair with the settled comfort of a man in his own kingdom. "Sorry about that little interruption," he said, waving one hand. "You know how marriages work. Mr. Johnson, sometimes you have to remind people of the terms of the agreement." Bumpy looked at him, said nothing, lifted his water glass, took one slow sip, set it back down without a sound, picked up his fork, and continued eating food he could no longer taste while across the table Marcus Sterling talked and drank and smiled and had absolutely no idea that the most consequential conversation of his life had already happened, and he had not been present for a single word of it. In every city in America, men have sat across tables from consequences they could not yet see wearing the face of a dinner guest, and by the time they understood what was sitting across from them, the meal was already over. Marcus made his mistake at 10:47 in the evening. The grandfather clock in the hallway had been marking every second of this night with the brass indifference of a machine that has no investment in human outcomes, its pendulum swinging back and forth through bourbon fumes and candlelight and the slow, methodical dismantling of a man who had spent 3 hours drinking his own self-control off one glass at a time. By 10:15, Marcus was standing. By 10:30, he was pacing back and forth across the living room rug with the heavy, slightly rolling momentum of a very large man whose body had decided it was finished pretending. His voice had climbed out of control and moved through loud and arrived at something uglier and more honest than either the register that lives at the absolute bottom of the bottle, where all the careful construction a man spends his sober hours building finally stops holding, and everything he actually is comes pushing up through the cracks. "You think I don't know exactly what you are?" Marcus stopped pacing and pointed across the room, bourbon sloshing against the side of his glass. "You think you can sit in my house, eat my food, drink my liquor, and look at me with those dead eyes like I'm something you scraped off your shoe? You are a criminal from Harlem. That is the complete sum of what you are. A lucky criminal who got old and learned how to dress himself." Bumpy sat in the leather chair with both hands resting flat on his knees and watched Marcus come toward him, the way you watch a wave approaching, that you have already decided to allow to break over you, because you know with complete certainty what is underneath the wave and what happens to the wave when it gets there. Marcus crossed the last 4 feet in 2 steps and wrapped both hands around Bumpy Johnson's throat. His hands were enormous, the hands of a 300-pound man who had spent his entire adult life believing that physical size was simply a more direct form of the same power that money represented, that a body large enough could solve any problem that presented itself by applying sufficient weight to it. His thumbs drove in hard below the jaw. His fingers locked behind. His full upper body weight came forward. Bumpy did not grab his wrists, did not struggle, did not produce a single sound. He turned his head slowly, with the complete unhurried calm of a man checking whether a window was open, and looked at the office door, which was open exactly 1 inch, which was the precise measurement he had needed. Illinois came through first. He crossed the hardwood floor without a sound, 6'2", 230 pounds of man moving with the smooth, purposeful, completely undramatic efficiency of someone who has entered rooms like this one before and understands that the only speed that matters is speed that arrives without announcement. 4 men followed in a sequence so practiced it looked choreographed, 2 through the office door, 2 through the hallway entrance, each one moving to a predetermined position at a corner of the room with the quiet geometric precision of a team that has rehearsed this exact configuration in other rooms in other cities and needed no instruction to execute it here. 11 seconds from the moment Illinois's foot crossed the threshold to the moment all 5 men were in position. No shouting, no furniture overturned, no weapons displayed for effect. Just 5 men filling the corners of a room until the room itself belonged to them entirely, until the house that Marcus Sterling had built stone by stone as a monument to his own dominance was simply, permanently, and completely no longer his house in any way that counted. Marcus's hands released Bumpy's throat, and he stepped backward, and his eyes moved around the room to Illinois, to the 4 corners, to Bumpy standing and straightening his tie with 2 fingers and rolling his neck once to the left with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on something that had no clean name. The expression of a man whose entire model of how the world works has just been demonstrated to be incorrect in every particular. "Get Elise to the car," Bumpy said to Illinois. 4 words. The tone of a man reading items from a grocery list. Illinois walked out without acknowledgement. The 4 men held their positions. Marcus's mouth opened and the words started coming, names he knew, numbers he could move, connections in Hartford and New Haven and the state capital, consequences Bumpy had not thought through, reasons this needed to stop right now, and Bumpy stood in the center of the room and listened to every word with the same flat, patient expression he had been carrying all evening. And when Marcus finally ran out of words, the room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the bourbon glass on the side table. "You had a house," Bumpy said. "Now you have a conversation." The moment a man discovers that the walls he built to project power were only ever projecting it inward back at himself is always the loneliest moment of his life. Because there is nobody left in the room who is surprised. Except him. Marcus went for money first. He went for money the way a drowning man goes for anything floating, without strategy, without dignity, with the pure animal desperation of a creature that has just understood for the first time that it is in water over its head, and the shore is not where it thought the shore was. "Name your number," Marcus said. His voice was cracking at the seams now. The smooth Connecticut executive completely gone. Something raw and more exposed pushing up through the surface, the voice of a man who has spent 40 years believing that every problem in the world has a price attached to it, and that finding the price was the same thing as solving the problem. 100,000, 200, $500,000 liquid by tomorrow morning. No paper, no trail, nothing that connects back to either of us or anyone connected to either of us. Whatever number makes this right, I will produce it. Just tell me the number. Bumpy looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a scan, processing the information, reading the damage, feeling nothing in particular about what the next step required. "You think this is about money," Bumpy said. "Everything in this world is about money," Marcus said. "That is the only language that actually—" "You put your hands around my throat," Bumpy said. Each word came down separately, placed with the deliberate care of a man setting stones into wet concrete, slow, level, permanent. "You put your hands on my daughter for 4 years inside this house, and you are standing in front of me right now trying to locate the correct number." The room smelled like spilled bourbon soaking into expensive carpet, cigar smoke trapped in curtains, and underneath, both the sharp, acidic smell of a large man sweating hard through a suit that cost more than most people in Harlem made in 6 months. Outside the windows, Connecticut was dark and silent and completely indifferent. The trees standing black against a black sky. The neighborhood asleep in the deep, peaceful way that neighborhoods sleep when nothing that happens inside their houses is ever required to reach the street. Bumpy turned to the 2 men on his left and gave them a look. Not a word. Not a gesture. A look the specific. Complete. Entirely unambiguous communication of a man transmitting something precise in a language that required no translation between people who had worked together long enough to share it fluently. They moved to Marcus the way a tide moves to a shore, not rushing, not announcing itself, simply closing the distance between where it was and where it needed to be with the inevitable unhurried efficiency of something that has never once in its existence failed to arrive. Marcus went to his knees in 8 seconds. Both arms came forward and flattened across the surface of his mahogany desk, the monument desk. The desk with the framed magazine covers and the politician photographs and the mounted elk head staring down with its glassy, permanent eyes at the scene below it. His hands spread wide on the wood, fingers open, and the sounds he began making were below language. They lived in the part of the human animal that existed before speech was invented. In the part that knows only 2 things: what is happening to my body right now. And please make it stop. The sounds lasted 38 seconds. Then the room went quiet in a way that was different from all the previous quiet of the evening, deeper, more final. The specific quiet of a thing that has been concluded rather than interrupted. Marcus sat against the wall with his back straight and both hands in his lap and stared at them. He turned them over, turned them back, spread the fingers wide and watched them and spread them again. They lay open and flat and motionless on his thighs. The fingers unable to curl, unable to grip, unable to close into the fist that had been making and keeping its promises in this house for 4 years. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he has just found that he does not recognize, something that used to belong to him and no longer responds to his ownership. When the hospital asks, Bumpy said, "You fell down the stairs. Dark hallway, top step, too much bourbon. That is the story. You say it once and you say it correctly and you say the same exact words every single time anyone asks you for the rest of your life. You never change one word of it." He picked up his jacket from the chair back and put it on and smoothed the lapels carefully. "Look at me," he said. Marcus looked up from his hands. His face was empty in the specific way of a man from whom the load-bearing structure has been removed, the thing that held the confidence and the performance and the cruelty all in place. The belief that his body was his most reliable instrument of control. That belief was gone. Not damaged. Not shaken. Removed. The way a surgeon removes something that was causing damage, cleanly, without leaving anything behind that would allow it to grow back. "You are alive," Bumpy said. "That is what tonight cost me to give you. Spend every day you have left understanding exactly what that means." He walked out through the living room, past the stone lions frozen mid-roar on the front steps, and got into the back seat where Illinois had the engine running and the heater already pushing warm air into the dark interior. The hospital report would record the mechanism of injury and the clinical extent of the damage in neutral medical language, but the reason a man's hand stopped working on a Tuesday night in Connecticut would remain. Permanently and by design. A piece of information that no form ever created has a box to put it in. The car was warm. The heater pushed steady, dry heat into the back seat and the windows fogged soft at the edges, and Illinois had the radio on low. Nat King Cole. Something slow and velvet and completely indifferent to the wreckage of the evening, sitting 30 minutes behind them on a dark Connecticut road. Elise sat with both hands folded tight in her lap, knuckles pressed white against each other, eyes locked straight through the windshield at the highway pulling under the headlights. She had not cried. She had not asked a single question when Illinois opened the back door and said quietly, "Miss Elise, it's time to go." She had simply stood up from the kitchen chair, walked through her own living room, stepped past the stone lions on the front steps, and gotten into the car without picking up her coat, without looking back, without saying one word to the walls of the house she had spent 4 years learning how to survive inside. That told Bumpy more than anything she could have said out loud. He let 14 minutes pass before either of them spoke. 14 minutes of dark highway and bare November trees and Nat King Cole and the specific weighted silence of 3 people moving through the same night from 3 completely different positions inside it. Illinois kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road and his mouth shut, which was the most valuable thing Illinois had ever learned to do. "Is he dead?" Elise asked. Her voice came out level, controlled, the voice of a woman who had trained herself over 4 years to ask difficult questions without letting the question show anywhere on her face or in her body. "No," Bumpy said. She nodded once, processed that, looked back at the road. 4 more minutes passed. A highway sign appeared and disappeared. The trees thickened on both sides and the road narrowed and the darkness outside the windows became total and complete. The kind of rural Connecticut dark that has no bottom to it. "Will he come after me?" she asked. "Will he come after you, after our family?" Bumpy turned and looked at his daughter in the dim interior light of the back seat. He looked at the purple mark spreading along her left cheekbone where the foundation had worn thin. He looked at the long sleeves pulled all the way down to her wrists in the middle of July. He looked at the way she held her shoulders pulled slightly forward and inward. The permanent protective posture of a body that had spent years bracing for impact the way other bodies learn to breathe, automatically, without thinking. Because the alternative was to be caught unprepared, and unprepared was dangerous. He had last seen her 6 months ago. She had been thinner then than the time before that. She was thinner now than 6 months ago. The kind of thin that has nothing to do with eating and everything to do with what a body does when it spends years running on fear instead of food. "Marcus Sterling will go to the hospital tonight," Bumpy said. His voice was flat and even as a table surface. "He will tell them." He fell down the stairs in the dark. He had been drinking, and he missed the top step, and he fell all the way down, and that is the complete and entire story of what happened to his hands. He will tell that story to every doctor, every nurse, every insurance form, every neighbor who asks, every person who looks at those hands for the rest of his natural life. He paused. And every single morning when he wakes up and reaches for his coffee cup and his fingers will not close around it every morning, every cup, every single day until he dies, he will remember exactly why that story can never change and never will. Elise stared at her father. The purple mark on her cheek caught the passing light of a highway lamp, and for 1 second looked almost black. "What exactly did you do to him?" she asked. "I corrected him," Bumpy said. "The kind of correction that sticks." She turned back to the window. A gas station appeared on the right and slid past cold white fluorescent light bleeding out into the November dark. A young attendant in an orange vest moving between the pumps with his breath showing in the air. Ordinary and completely indifferent to the car passing him carrying the specific weight of what had just been done 30 minutes up the road. Then Elise asked the question she had been holding in her chest since the moment Illinois walked through the office door. "Daddy." Her voice dropped low enough that it lived underneath the music. "Do I still have a clean life after tonight? Does what happened in that house follow me? Does it sit next to my name somewhere? In some file? Some record does. Does it find me 10 years from now when I'm trying to be someone different in a different city?" Bumpy was quiet. The highway curved right. A town appeared in the distance, scattered lights through the trees. Civilization reassembling itself after miles of dark. "What happened in that house will never see the inside of a courtroom," he said. "It will never appear in a newspaper or a police report or any document filed anywhere in this country under your name or mine. Marcus Sterling paid for his silence tonight with something that cannot be returned, and men who have paid that price do not go looking to pay more of it. They go looking for ways to live quietly and with what they already owe, and pray nobody ever asks them to pay again." He let that settle for a full minute before he continued. "You have a clean life," he said. "You have always had a clean life. The only thing standing between you and it was a man who believed that his size and his money and his fists gave him ownership over your future. He no longer has that belief, and he no longer has the fists." Elise pressed her lips together hard. Her eyes filled completely, but nothing ran over that same iron discipline, that same total control. But this time it was not fear doing the holding. It was something that had been absent from her body for so long that she had forgotten it had a name. It felt like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for 4 years. It felt like the first full breath of a woman who had just understood, in the warm dark of this car on this highway, that the locked door she had been living behind was no longer locked and was never going to be locked again. Illinois kept driving north. The heater kept running. Nat King Cole kept singing about love like love was a thing that came without cost. The choices made in that Connecticut house on that November night were never recorded in any document that courts or newspapers would ever locate, but every person in that warm, moving car carried them forward the way the body carries old damage. Below the surface, in the bone, permanent and silent and completely without apology. Harlem in July smelled like hot tar bubbling up through sidewalk cracks, frying pork fat drifting out of open kitchen windows, cheap cologne and cheaper cigarettes, and underneath all of it, underneath everything, that particular smell that a city develops when it has been through too much too fast, and the grief has nowhere left to go except into the concrete itself, into the walls, into the air that everybody breathes without thinking about what they are breathing. The city had changed since 1963. It had changed since 1965. It had changed again in 1967 and was still in the process of changing in ways that nobody standing inside the change could fully see yet. Buildings that used to mean something had new names on their doors. Corners that used to belong to specific men belong to different men now, or belong to nobody, which in Harlem was always more dangerous than belonging to somebody wrong. But Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue had not changed. Wells had the specific stubborn permanence of places that survive decades, not because they adapt, but because they become load-bearing, because enough people have been coming through their doors long enough that the place itself becomes part of the structure of the neighborhood, and removing it would leave a hole that nothing else could fill the same way. Dorothy had been working the morning shift at Wells since 1946. She was 53 years old in July of 1968, and she had placed a coffee cup in front of Ellsworth Johnson more times than either of them had ever thought to count. She set it down in front of him that Thursday morning the same way she always did, without asking, without ceremony, without making it a production, because some rituals between people who have known each other long enough stop being gestures and become simply part of how the morning works. Bumpy ordered the chicken, opened the paper, drank his coffee. He was on page 6 when the paper stopped moving. Dorothy looked up from the counter because after 22 years, she knew the rhythms of this man at this table, the way a musician knows the rhythms of a song she has played 10,000 times. And the rhythm had changed. The paper was still. The hand holding it was still. The stillness was wrong in a way that registered in her body before it registered in her mind. She came around the counter moving fast. The man at the next booth was already standing. A woman near the window had her hand over her mouth. Someone was at the payphone on the wall, speaking in the flat, controlled voice of a person who has seen this before and knows that the most useful thing you can do in the next 60 seconds is stay calm and speak clearly and not waste a single word. Ellsworth Johnson was 62 years old. He had walked out of Sing Sing twice. He had survived 6 attempts on his life that made it into any kind of record, and at least 4 more that did not. He had survived the Luciano years, and the federal surveillance years, and the years when 3 separate agencies of the United States government had his name on active investigation files and were waiting for him to make one mistake they could build a case around. He had survived every violent thing that 40 years of living the way he chose to live had sent directly at him. His heart did not care about any of that. His heart had its own accounting and its own timeline, and on a Thursday morning in July of 1968, over a plate of fried chicken and a cup of coffee and a newspaper open to page 6, his heart closed its books. The ambulance came in 8 minutes. It did not matter. The thing that had happened at that table did not wait for ambulances. By noon, the information was moving through Harlem in expanding rings the way a stone moves water outward, widening. Each ring carrying the news a little further and a little louder until it reached the edges of the neighborhood and kept going. By 2 in the afternoon, men were standing on corners in the July heat, with their hands in their pockets having conversations with their eyes. By evening, the city felt structurally different in a way that was impossible to point to directly, but impossible to miss, like a note that had been playing underneath everything for 30 years, had gone silent. And the silence had weight, had edges, had a shape you could almost press your hand against. No gun had fired, no knife had moved, No enemy had won and no war had started, and no headline the next morning would say anything except that Ellsworth Johnson had died of a heart attack at a restaurant in Harlem on a Thursday in July. The booth at Wells where he sat that morning stayed empty for the rest of the day. Dorothy did not seat anyone in it. She did not explain why, and nobody asked her to explain. Some things in a neighborhood communicate themselves without language, between people who share enough history that language would only make the communication smaller and less accurate than the silence. The date is in the public record and always will be, but what Harlem actually lost that July morning, and the exact shape of the space it left behind, is information that no document has ever been able to hold. 6 weeks after Bumpy Johnson died at a table in Wells' restaurant, Elise Sterling walked into a Connecticut courthouse on a Tuesday morning wearing a cream-colored blouse with short sleeves and filed for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. The proceeding took 13 minutes. Marcus Sterling's attorney submitted all required paperwork without his client present. The judge noted the absence in the record, stamped the documents, and moved to the next case on his docket without looking up. Marcus Sterling was alive. He was also, as of November 1963, a man who had reorganized the entire practical architecture of his daily existence around two hands that no longer functioned the way hands are supposed to function. He ate with utensils that had been modified by an occupational therapist in Hartford. He signed documents with a pen gripped in a way that his fourth-grade teacher would not have recognized. He buttoned his shirts in the morning, sitting on the edge of his bed with the focused, effortful concentration of a man performing a task that used to take 4 seconds and now took 4 minutes. Every morning, every shirt, every single day. He told the staircase story 47 times in the first year. To doctors, to the insurance adjuster, to his attorney, to his business partners who noticed the change in his handshake, to neighbors who asked what happened, to his mother who flew up from Georgia and sat across from him at his kitchen table and looked at his hands and did not believe a word of the staircase story, but understood, from something in her son's eyes when he told it, that this was not a story she was meant to question. By the second year, he no longer experienced it as a lie. It had simply become the official version of an event that the official version was all that remained of. The other version, the version with the 5 men and the leather chair and the mahogany desk, and the sounds he had made that he could not now fully reconstruct in memory, lived in a part of his mind that he had learned, with considerable practice, to keep a locked door between himself and. He sold the Connecticut house in 1965. He moved to a smaller property outside Providence where the neighbors were polite and incurious, and nobody knew his wife's former name or her father's name or what the word Harlem signified beyond a neighborhood in New York City that was not their neighborhood. The mahogany desk went with the house. The new family had 3 children and used it as a craft table in the basement playroom. Their youngest drew horses on it in crayon and magic marker over the course of several years. The 2 faint parallel marks pressed deep into the wood near the left edge were buried under layers of crayon wax and dried glue and the cheerful, ordinary debris of a childhood that had no connection to the events of November 1963. The marks were still there underneath all of it. They would still be there if you stripped everything back down to the wood. Some impressions go deep enough that nothing applied to the surface afterward can reach them. Elise took an apartment on the Upper West Side in October of 1963. She started at a small publishing house on 57th Street, answering correspondence, moved to copy editing within 18 months, and was running a department of 8 people by 1970. Her colleagues described her as precise, patient, and quietly formidable, the kind of person who never raised her voice because she never needed to, because when she spoke, people listened, because the quality of her attention in a room had a weight to it that made other people sit up straighter without understanding exactly why. She wore short-sleeved blouses starting the first week of October 1963. She wore them every day, regardless of season, with a cardigan in winter, without one in summer. Her coworkers never knew what that meant. It meant everything. She kept one photograph of her father on her desk for the rest of her working life. Bumpy in his charcoal suit on a Harlem corner in late afternoon light, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at something off to the left of the frame with that expression that had always communicated entirely different things to entirely different people, depending on which side of it they were standing on. Publishing colleagues assumed he was a businessman, a lawyer maybe, someone important in a quiet way. She never corrected them and never felt the absence of their understanding. Illinois retired in 1969. Where he went is not in any file. The four men who stood at the four corners of a Connecticut office on a November night dissolved back into their lives in their respective cities and became, once again, people that records found completely unremarkable. That had always been the precise point of them. Harlem fractured in the years after, not explosively gradually, the way a structure fractures when the single load-bearing element holding everything in alignment is removed, and the remaining pieces find their own new positions according to their own competing weights and needs. New names rose. New arrangements were made. New men occupied positions that older men had held and made the mistake, repeatedly, of believing that the position was the source of the power, rather than simply the place where the power rested while a specific man was alive to hold it correctly. Power itself never left Harlem. Power never leaves anywhere. It moves. It pours into new containers. It finds the lowest available point and fills it. Cold at the bottom regardless of how warm the surface looks. Present in the places where you would swear there was nothing. Running underneath the visible city the way water runs beneath a street structural. Invisible. Indifferent to the names of every man it has ever flowed beneath and will flow beneath long after those names are gone. The monogrammed handkerchief initialed Iga, in black thread, folded flat, pressed crisp, found in his inside breast pocket at Wells' restaurant on that Thursday morning was kept by Dorothy in a cigar box in the back of her linen closet until she died in 1991. Her daughter found it during the clearing out, did not recognize the initials, and let it go. Some objects that carried enormous weight for the people closest to them leave no mark at all on the record of the world. They simply pass out of existence quietly, taking everything they witnessed with them. This story was never meant to celebrate the methods it was told, because power and the cost of its abuse and the price required to correct it wear the same face in every city, in every decade, and in every room where someone decides that a closed door makes them permanent. In that world, nobody was clean. There were only two kinds of people, those who understood the rules, and those who learned them the hard way. Bumpy Johnson never killed out of anger. He acted out of balance. He loved his daughter the only way a man can love when nobody ever taught him that love was supposed to be gentle. Harlem lost him in 1968, but the question he left behind never died. If you were him that night, do you stay silent to keep the peace, or do you move to keep the law? Because some lines, once crossed, only get corrected one way. If you want more stories where power never shouts it, only whispers, subscribe right now. In the dark, the game never stops. Neither do we.